The most important Trump administration meeting on Wednesday is not happening here in Washington at all. It's happening in Moscow, where Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is meeting with his Russian counterpart, Foreign Minister Lavrov. So the question is, what are they going to talk about? Or more precisely, what are they going to argue about? Because there's going to be a lot of arguing in this meeting. That's a little ironic because people thought the Trump administration was going to come in and be fairly chummy with the Russians and with Russian President Vladimir Putin. But in fact, there's a lot of tension in the air, and this idea that the Trump administration would go soft on Russia is slowly fading away. Right now, three big things to argue about. The first big thing to argue about is Syria. The Russians are the biggest protector of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This is the same Syrian regime that the U.S. struck with cruise missiles last week because it was using chemical weapons on its own people. Now U.S. officials are saying the Russians not only probably knew about that use of chemical weapons, but may actually be covering up the evidence as well. So there's going to be a pretty tense argument about Syria, the future of President Assad, and what the Russians did and didn't know about chemical weapons use there. Second issue to discuss and to argue about is NATO. The Russians are very unhappy about the expansion of NATO in recent years closer to their own borders, yet President Trump, just on the eve of this meeting, signed a Senate resolution that approves the expansion of NATO once again to include Montenegro. That will make the Russians extremely unhappy. Third, and also obviously, is Ukraine. The U.S. continues to think that the Russians are pressuring the government of Ukraine, trying to intimidate the Ukrainians into adopting a more pro-Moscow policy. A lot of unhappiness about that, economic sanctions in place because of that. Surely there'll be some tense conversation about that as well. Of course, hanging over all this is going to be the assertion by many in the U.S., including the FBI, that and most intelligence committee members in Congress, that the Russians interfered in the U.S. 2016 presidential election. This is awkward for President Trump and Secretary Tillerson because there's some evidence that the Russians did that precisely to help Donald Trump win the presidency. They'd like to get sanctions that were imposed by President Obama because of this election interference rolled back, but that's almost impossible for President Trump to do under the current circumstances and while this is being investigated. So more to argue about than to agree about when Rex Tillerson goes to Moscow.